Is StarCraft a game of pure skill, or does RNG play a significant role in whether you win or lose? If you have played Brood War, you are likely to know that there is some randomness involved in the game. A common example would be that the ground units have a chance to miss when shooting at enemies on a higher elevation level. In this video, I'll try to cover these topics and talk about the role of RNG in games in general. Firstly, let's get misses out of the way. There are only a few ways in which a unit can miss its shot. Units that shoot at each other with ranged weapon behaviors have a base 1 out of 256 chance to miss. Units that shoot from low ground to high ground or at a unit that's hidden behind a doodad have a 120 out of 256 chance to miss, which is roughly 47%. The next thing that I want to mention are random attack cooldowns. Each time a unit attacks, its next attack has between an extra -1 to +2 frames added to its cooldown, but it can't be less than 5 or more than 250 frames total after the addition. It's really easy to observe this on a pair of Goliaths, because their attack sounds repeatedly synchronize and desynchronize over time. From this point on, we'll be getting into random events that are increasingly more obscure. Units with script-controlled movement, which mostly means units that have complicated movement animations, may have a random 1-frame delay after they were ordered to move. This could have been a performance-saving measure, so that large groups of units don't start moving at once. Zerg larvae have a random spawn timer of between 318 frames to 366 frames. Potentially, that's a pretty significant difference of around 2 real-life seconds on fastest, but it is actually structured in a way where it's supposed to even out over time. There are some actions or orders or events in StarCraft that get checked every few frames instead of each frame, depending on either internal unit timers or maybe global timers that are shared between multiple units. This means that, for example, when you storm with High Templars, there will always be a particular random moment where the damage is not dealt, as storms actually always skip exactly 1 tick of their damage. This skip obviously may not end up mattering in a particular case, but you can imagine a scenario where if you take out your units outside of the storm during its duration, this random tick may not have happened yet, in which case you get extra damage compared to if this random tick did happen early on in the animation where your units were still inside of the storm. So, remember how attack cooldowns have this random leeway of 4 frames? Well, these random cooldown differences get even bigger if you get into the weeds. In specific cases where the attack cooldown expires before the animation finishes and the command called go to repeat attack is used, an internal unit delay timer kicks in and pushes the attack back 9 frames from when the cooldown expired. This can be seen among a large group of units: Zealots, Ultralisks, Zerglings, Marines, Firebats, just to name a few. In the case of Marines, the way this affects them is this actually makes their steamed DPS worse than it could have been if they solely relied on their raw data values, from which we would take 15 frames cooldown normally and 7 frames cooldown when under the effects of steam packs. When repeatedly attacking, Marines have 7 frames of animation, after which they reach go to repeat attack. This gives us 3 main scenarios of what happens with their cooldown. If Marines would have +0 random cooldown, no change, they have their true cooldown of 7 frames. If Marines get +1 or +2 random cooldown, they have a cooldown of either 8 or 9. They reach go to repeat attack in 7 frames, wait 1 or 2 frames and start attacking again. The internal order cooldown is programmed to refresh after an attack cooldown expires. If Marines would have -1 random cooldown, they only have a cooldown of 6, and the internal unit cooldown of 9 frames is applied afterwards because we haven't reached go to repeat attack yet. This causes them to have a real cooldown of 15 frames. 15 frames would have been their true cooldown without steam packs, So you can see that this is a pretty noticeable DPS hit. In EVDIP, back when I was tinkering with firebuds in the ancient year of 2019, I ran into a particularly nasty case of this, that I've then unequivocally thought of as a bug. When I tried to change the firebud attack cooldown to be 17 frames instead of 22. Well, because the firebud's attack animation lasts 10 frames, and the cooldown after stimpaks goes from 17 to 8, in 3 out of 4 cases it expires before the animation is done. And since go to repeat attack was not called yet, the extra 9 frames were added each time, making the cooldown longer than if the firebud did not stim. Personally, I still think that this is a bug and not a feature, but since it's always been this way, in terms of unmodded StarCraft, it's just part of the game. There is one way around this cooldown increase bug, if you want to call it that is really easy to show on an even more extreme version of the modded firebud example. If you reorder the affected unit to attack again, for example by right-clicking, which you may not actually want to do because it causes the attack animation to reset, which sometimes, for example in the case of Marines, makes it last longer. It actually resets the order timer and goes back to whatever cooldown you would have. So this means that you can have some units attack faster by spam right-clicking in the right moments in unmodded Brood War. And who said that StarCraft wasn't a rhythm game? On top of what I've already talked about, order cooldowns are randomly rearranged every 150 frames, which may increase or decrease some attack cooldowns. This is also likely a performance saving measure, and it's not that rare either. 150 frames equals about 6 real-life seconds on fastest. Obviously, in StarCraft matches, units fighting for prolonged periods of time are a pretty common sight. Since unit DPS itself is already RNG reliant, it's not hard to say that competitive Brood War matches could, in fact, be decided by a dice roll. This is not to say that they always are, but more on that later. I think this is already a fairly compelling case for why there's a lot of randomness involved in an average Brood War match. But before we continue talking about that, I wanted to sneak in some related trivia about one of my favorite units, the Queen. Ensnare is supposed to either increase attack cooldowns by 25% rounded down, or remove existing cooldown buffs. It has a bit of a bad rep, with manual tests showing that it either has reduced or no effects on the attack speed of particular units. Interestingly enough, this is partially a result of the order reset weirdness. Let's take a look at the Ultralisk, which reportedly, according to Wikipedia, is almost completely unaffected by Ensnare's attack speed debuff. Its attack animation lasts exactly 15 frames, and it has a cooldown of between 14 to 17 frames. With Ensnare, we would have a cooldown of between 17 to 21 frames. Let's assume the following scenario. We have an Ultralisk that attacks exactly 4 times, once each with any particular random cooldown it may have. Let's try to sum up how much time that would actually take. For the Ensnared Ultralisk, this is really simple. It has to wait exactly 17 frames, exactly 18 frames, exactly 20 frames, and exactly 21 frames. This gives us 76 frames total for 4 attacks, 19 frames on average per attack. For the Healthy Ultralisk, this is slightly more complicated because we have a single attack where the order reset will come into play. We know that 3 attacks take 15, 16, and 17 frames, but the 14 frame attack will actually take 23 frames instead, because it's 14 frames plus the added forced wait of 9 frames. This gives us a total of 71 frames, barely 5 less than the Ensnared Ultralisk, with an average of 17.75 frames per attack. This is so close that with the added variance from random cooldowns and order resets, it's going to be very hard to measure unless you commit to hours long sample sizes where you manage to avoid errors caused by manual data collection. Now that we are done with queens and their lovely green goo, let's get back on track and talk about RNG in games. If you have been following the esports trends for the past few years, you could have noticed that nearly every successful game has some dose of RNG in it. It's not always very noisy or pronounced, but then, with some exceptions such as low ground, high ground misses, it's not really something you always think about in Brood or either. To give you some examples of games that have at the very least made a splash, Hearthstone has had many cards with random effects, such as Ragnaros, that could decide whether a player lives or dies. This is ignoring the fact that card games are inherently random due to the draw itself. League of Legends currently has semi-random crit chance and random neutral objectives, where the dragon spawns will randomly change between each game. Shooters like Counter-Strike may have some accuracy-related RNG, whether it is due to dispersion or spray patterns not necessarily being deterministic. All of these mechanics serve to introduce variance into the game. Variance that allows for a player that is slightly worse than another to still win if they can facilitate a situation that allows for the odds to be in their favor. We have to ask ourselves then, is variance bad because it may affect the expression of skill? In my mind, the answer to that is no. Because really, variance makes for a better show. In a game such as Age of Wonders, the moments I remember the most were the most unlikely streaks of RNG, such as when my trusty skeleton warrior slaughtered the best hero of my friend. But even if we are okay with some RNG, we have to admit that too much of it is probably not right in certain formats. The format is the key thing here. In a card game, you may want to have a series that's like a best of 9 instead of a best of 1. Because if it were a single game, it could be decided solely by variance caused by the luck of the draw. If you have a longer series, and perhaps certain metagame features such as side decking, you decrease the variance and allow for player knowledge or skill to come through. And players don't seem to mind RNG that much, and in MOBAs such as League or Dota, players just try to play around the randomness. For example, in League, teams may decide whether to prioritize the Drake or not based on which Drake has spawned. This information is not available from the onset of the game, and realistically it could nonetheless be the case that a match is won or lost because of an unlucky combination of Drakes. In StarCraft we also do try to avoid variance. After all, it's rare to play into a situation where the margin is so narrow that it could just be decided by a coin flip. We naturally tend to look for opportunities that are favorable for us. Still, it is ultimately unavoidable that there will be some cases where lucky or unlucky RNG decides whether a unit lives or dies. In a post written during the last hours of 2007, Day9 outlines his idea that the ideal strategy game would minimize the elements of chance and luck. And yet he goes on to bring up Warcraft 3 as one such example, which is a game where damage ranges are randomized and where you have random crits and dodges. This actually shows us when variance is at its best. Not when it decides games on its own, but when the game provides enough of a toolbox for players to play around that variance and to find their marginal advantage. When the game almost makes players believe that variance does not exist at times, even when it does, such as Brood War. And because it does exist unseen, it almost gives the game itself a soul, a will, a way to tell a story that overcomes the odds. Thank you for watching this video, and many thanks to my patrons that make it possible for me to make content. If you have any questions, remember to like and comment. I'll try to respond to as many comments as I can.